From the snow-capped Himalayas to the desolate deserts of Mesopotamia, in almost every nook and corner of the ancient world, one figure keeps reappearing in multiple myths, stories, and works of art: dragons. It is these large serpentine creatures from legends that have overcome geographical and cultural barriers, as they have been depicted on ancient Chinese scrolls, in European folklore, Native American artwork, and even in African carvings. The persistence of the dragon image throughout human history brings up one intriguing question. Could dragons have actually existed? Or is their near-universal presence a byproduct of something else? Perhaps a shared memory of creatures long gone, like dinosaurs. In this journey through the history of dragons, through various historical records, religious scriptures, and oral traditions, we are going to historicize and contextualize their existence. Was the dragon a concept limited to the bounds of human imagination? Or could it have been a perpetuated fantasy, inspired by reality? And if it existed, what exactly did these ancients witness? Ancient dragon myths across cultures. The dragon occupies a leading position in the mythology of virtually any ancient civilization. From ancient Chinese works to Greek myths and further to Norse sagas, they quite often appear in the form of mighty, otherworldly creatures whose characteristics change from culture to culture. Despite the variation in their different features and symbolism depending on the locale, the presentation of a dragon remains the same everywhere. It is a creature of enormous power and influence. In ancient China, the dragon was a creature to be regarded with awe, not fear. It was an heavenly deity aligned with the skies, a powerful, forceful, and auspicious creature. Since it held control over rainfall and storms, the dragon was an extremely important creature in agricultural societies, whose lives depended on the vagaries of nature. Chinese dragons are typically described as long, serpentine creatures that can fly without wings, an indication, perhaps, that these animals were not constrained by the same natural laws as other creatures. Mesopotamian mythology represents one of the earliest recorded usages of dragon imagery. The Babylonian creation myth, which is referred to as the Enuma Elish, features a goddess by the name of Tiamat, who is a primordial being that takes on the form of a dragon and leads a battle against younger gods. She is defeated by the heroic god Marduk, who splits her body into two parts to create both heaven and earth. The symbol of Tiamat as a dragon-like creature shows chaos and untamed forces of nature, a common theme among dragon lore. In medieval Europe, the role of the dragon took on an increasingly sinister tone. These fire-spewing monsters were seen as something to be slaughtered, often taking on the role of the devil or human sin. One of the most famous stories in European history is that of St. George of Christianity slaying a dragon, good over evil. The dragons usually illustrated in European tales were somewhat identical in appearance to modern reconstructions of dinosaurs, with their great leathered wings and huge body and long tail. Meanwhile, the feathered serpent deity of the Aztecs and preceding cultures, Quetzalcoatl, combined the dragon-like features with the avian in the Mesoamerican context. Quetzalcoatl's travel between the heavens and earth only extends the parallel found in the Chinese dragon's celestial associations, with the suggestion that the archetype of the dragon as a being which transcended natural boundaries was a powerful one across cultures. This host of similarities among various mythologies begs a more deep-seated question. Why did so many disparate civilizations, separated in both time and place, create such similar creatures of legend? Might it be that these cultures were drawing upon real-world encounters with animals passed down through story and oral tradition? Fossils and the birth of the dragon myth. The discovery of large fossils is likely one of the prime movers for the emergence of dragon myths. Well before the emergence of paleontology as a science, large areas of the world's land masses would have revealed to ancient peoples the fossil remnants of huge creatures' remains that resembled no known animals. Without scientific explanation, it is not too much of a leap to see how these bones might be interpreted as the remnants of enormous, terrifying beasts. In China, this linkage of the myths and fossils about dragons is immense. The Chinese people have been finding the fossils of dinosaurs since time immemorial, though they did not know them by that name. For them, these huge bones were the remains of dragons, a divine being in their beliefs. Even today, some parts of China have plenty of fossils of giant dinosaurs like Mamenchisaurus and Sinraptor. these could be very instrumental in proving this belief when discovered in ancient times. The Chinese weren't the only ones to draw this connection. Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder wrote in his Natural History about big bones that were turning up in far-flung corners of the world, speculating that they belonged to mythical creatures such as griffins and dragons. Similar stories, no doubt nurtured by the discovery of fossilized remains, are to be found in other corners of the world, often involving mythologies with either dragons or dragon-like creatures. The deserts of Mongolia are one of the most heavily concentrated dinosaur fossil deposits in the world today. It is a region steeped in stories of dragons, and it's so easy to imagine the ancient peoples of these areas having found dinosaur bones and integrating those into their lore. These big, clawed bones of theropod dinosaurs, like Tarbosaurus, could easily have been interpreted as evidence of dragons, while the long necks and massive bodies of sauropods might have inspired the descriptions of the serpentine or winged creatures. In contrast, the fossil record provides a more empirical reason for the enduring presence of dragons in human mythology. Confronted with the bones of creatures they did not understand, early humans invented stories about these discoveries that helped them understand what it was they were finding. These stories were passed down through each generation, evolving into the myths and legends we are familiar with today. The evolution of the dragon in West and East. While both the East and West have incorporated dragons within their cultural frames, each had unique expressions of this creation. The Western dragon might be seen to be described as a terrifying monster, which breathes fire and protects its gold treasure from being taken by others, and terrorizes villages in this way. Dragons are considered blessed and wise creatures in the flow of water, life, and good fortune in Eastern cultures, especially those of China and Japan. The Western dragon has taken a lot of its aspects from ancient Greek and Roman mythology. The term dragon itself came from the Greek word drakon, meaning any large serpent. In these early traditions, the dragons were not yet the fire-breathing monsters they would later become in medieval lore, but they were formidable creatures nonetheless. For instance, in the Iliad, Homer described a dragon as a giant serpent that a hero was supposed to slay. This would subsequently be echoed in many stories of dragons being killed over the centuries thereafter. As Christianity spread throughout Europe, so too did the implication of the dragon with evil and sin, now far removed from its more neutral role in pre-Christian times. This was largely due to the influence of the Book of Revelation, wherein Satan is described as a great red dragon cast out of heaven by the archangel Michael. The resulting association of dragons with the devil clinched the creature's status as the villain of Christian mythology, and by the Middle Ages, the slaying of dragons had become one of the most persistent motifs in European art and literature, whereas, on the other hand, the Eastern dragon was never associated with evil. The dragons of China, among all others, were very well regarded as a symbol of imperial power, wisdom, and longevity. Emperors were often described as being descended from dragons, and the dragon became a symbol of the emperor's divine right to rule. In Japan, too, dragons are well considered and very commonly shown as a protector of nature and humanity. The Japanese dragon was associated with water and was said to control the weather, particularly the rain, which was highly important to agricultural-based communities. The reason this is so is that, within the evolution of the dragon in both Western and Eastern thought, different cultures harnessed the creature for their own religious and philosophical needs. Whereas in the West, the dragon became a symbol of hostile forces that a hero would be required to vanquish. In the East, it became representative of the conjoining between man and nature. Despite such differences, however, both traditions shared an almost identical fascination with dragons as creatures of immense power and mystery. A paleontological connection. The largest flying creatures to have ever existed, such as Pteranodon and Quetzalcoatlus, had wingspans over 30 feet, while the functionally identical ones fell between 10 and 20 feet. Their extinction, many millions of years ago, might have polarized stories about flying beasts that could take to the air, and perhaps gave rise to images of dragons in flight. Such fossils, if they were to be found in ancient times by people who knew nothing about paleontology, could only lead to speculation of some powerful flying creature. The connection between such ancient creatures and myths of dragons probably isn't coincidental, but get stuck in the interpretation that humanity gives to these impressive remains from far antiquity. Accounts do exist of megafauna that could have spurred the inspiration to invent the dragons. In particular, large reptiles like Megalania, a giant extinct monitor lizard of Australia, may have directly inspired the Aboriginal myths about fearsome dragon-like creatures. This reptile was estimated to be up to 23 feet long, and the terror it might have inspired in early human populations could have resulted in exaggerated stories passed down through generations. Similarly, large species of snakes, such as the titanoboa, a prehistoric serpent reaching lengths of over 40 feet, would surely have impressed themselves upon any early human population who came across its remains or even word about its existence. These prehistoric animals, along with early man's discovery of their huge fossilized remains, provide a sensible explanation of how ancient dragon myths could have originated. Whether it was the real-life encounters with hazardous megafauna or the discovery of fossils, humans likely used their imagination to fill in what they would not have understood. This might explain why the descriptions of dragons often resemble what we now know as dinosaurs, huge reptilian beasts with intimidating features, whether winged, fire-breathing, or aquatic. Dragons in religious texts and ancient writings. From myth and folkloric tales, they extend even to religious texts and historical accounts once presumed to constitute a factual description of the world. These sources, considered so revered by so many civilizations, provide a more formalized view of dragons in their creation as beings of immense power, either as protectors or destroyers. Perhaps the most overt example is from the Bible, which refers to dragons principally in the Old Testament. For instance, in the book of Job, Leviathan appeared as a sea monster that could only be killed by the gods with non-existent weapons, capable of spitting fire from his mouth to instill terror upon ships and sailors. While modern scholars would consider Leviathan to be a metaphor for chaos, or perhaps even an hyperbolic description of a known animal, such as a crocodile or whale, the image of Leviathan does fall into the archetype of the dragon, something in awe and almost invincible even to the gods. The New Testament book of Revelation describes the dragon as a cosmic evil, a red, multi-headed beast that represents the fallen angel, Satan himself. Thus, the concept of the dragon as a personification of evil in Christian eschatology extended the role of dragons in medieval European thought as an antagonist to be vanquished by a virtuous hero or divine intervention. Likewise, ancient Sumerian texts speak to dragon-like creatures in their myths, joining the ranks of some of the world's earliest known writings. The Sumerian deity Ninurta was a god of war and hunting who fought against and defeated a dragon-like creature. The Arsag, a demon said to be able to poison rivers and kill with his breath. This speaks very clearly to the image of the dragon as a symbol of chaos and destruction, one that must be vanquished by the gods or their human representatives. In ancient Egypt, dragons adopted more symbolic shapes in the serpent Apep, who battled every night against the sun, god Ra. Apep was a huge snake or dragon-like animal that personified darkness and chaos. Every morning, Ra's victory over him symbolized order above chaos, a cosmic fight which reflected itself in the life of mortals. Greco-Roman literature is also filled with the descriptions of dragon-like creatures. But the most famous myth concerns Python, a giant serpent or dragon that guarded the oracle of Delphi. And in one version or another, this python was said to have been slain by the Greek god Apollo, a triumph of light and learning over darkness and ignorance. Similarly, a Greek historian named Herodotus wrote about flying serpents found in the deserts of Arabia. The animals were unknown to his readers, but resemble some of the descriptions of dragons in medieval accounts. In ancient India, dragons exist in the form of Nagas, powerful serpent beings, resident in the underworld, or the ocean, who are able to take human form. Nagas were feared and revered at the same time, associated with water, fertility, and sometimes destruction. They were not viewed as intrinsically malevolent, but rather as capricious beings whose power was best left treated respectfully. Religious texts and ancient writings add another dimension to our conceptions of dragons. These beings are not merely the product of fantasy, but are actually symbols within the religious and cultural systems in which their recording appears. Whether an opponent who is bested by a particular force of chaos or divine beings representing some natural forces, dragons are arguably part of the space that connects the human and cosmic, natural and supernatural. Knights, dragons, and dinosaurs. The image of a knight against a dragon has taken a place as one of the most recognizable for medieval European mythology. Perhaps the most famous of all dragon-slaying tales, the story of St. George and the dragon epitomizes the struggle between good and evil. This monster is not just a terrifying beast, but a symbol of sin, destruction and chaos, and should be subdued by a virtuous knight. But a close look at many of these medieval dragons reveals some amazing similarities to animals that today would fall into the category of dinosaurs. They are mainly portrayed as enormous, lizard-like animals with long necks, powerful tails, and razor-sharp claws. Some even breathe fire, which in a way could be imagined to exaggerate the immense, really powerful physical capability of a real animal. Where, in these descriptions, can one not think of similarities to some dinosaurs, like the Tyrannosaurus rex or the Allosaurus? Some of the most ancient depictions of dragons in medieval manuscripts, such as the Aberdeen Bestiary and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, show creatures that more accurately resemble theropod dinosaurs, rather than the flying dragons that have been made so popular over time. Early drawings of dragons often depict the creatures as long bird-like arms and legs, with scales. These characteristics more accurately describe certain dinosaurs. Knights within such stories are often the victors. However, from the physical descriptions of the dragons they slay, it sounds like quite a formidable opponent, one perhaps inspired by fossil finds, unknowingly perpetuating such tales of the ancient battles. Fossil excavation was anything but a science during the Middle Ages. It's not beyond the realm of possibility, however, that the remains of large, ancient animals did surface from time to time and were mistaken for dragons. In places such as England, where the myths of the Romans and Selans about dragon-like animals were already well established, such a find could have been seen as proof that dragons were, in fact, creatures that lived in the world many years ago. In that case, stories of fearless knights fighting those monsters could have been elaborated to fit such a discovery into the cultural need for heroic figures, along with the tangible proof of these enormous bones. Besides, most medieval stories focus on themes of moral or spiritual redemption. A dragon is an antagonist, symbolically showing the moral fallacy or some sort of inner conflict of humanity. This hero was no mere warrior, but a savior, his dragon slaying purifying the land of corruption. Indeed, this would prove to be such a strong narrative trope within European mythology that the picture of the dragon remained that of a fearsome foe, long after science had started to uncover the truth behind the bones of long-dead creatures. The dragon in the modern imagination. As scientific knowledge grew, particularly with the rise of paleontology in the 19th century, the modern understanding of dinosaurs began to supplant earlier beliefs about dragons. Fossils that had previously been explained as dragon bones were now found to correctly be dinosaur bones, and this realization was just beginning to alter public perception. While dragons were becoming strictly mythological, dinosaurs became real creatures that had actually lived on the Earth millions of years in the past. But even as people learned more and more about dinosaurs, the magic of the dragon did not falter. Indeed, the image of the dragon continues to change with new forms that can be seen in literature, art, and popular culture. The dragon remains a symbol of power and mystery, a synonym for the unknown, echoing ancient fears and awe when these creatures first formed. These dragons went through a revival in modern fantasy literature. Authors such as J.R.R. Tolkien with The Hobbit and George R.R. Martin with A Song of Ice and Fire bring dragons back to the center stage of their worlds, reimagining the ancient myth with new imagination. Be that as it may, these dragons often retain most of the traits common to their ancient roots: intelligence, power, and linkage with the primal forces of the earth. All these ongoing modern fascinations with dragons speak to a deeper human desire to understand the forces that shape our world, both natural and supernatural. Dragons serve as a bridge between the known and unknown, a reminder that much about the past and even the present remains beyond full comprehension. The final question. As we trace the history of dragons through mythology and paleontology, one question still begs to be asked. Could dragons have existed in some form, or are they just the product of human imagination and interpretation of natural phenomena seen by people in ancient times? In answering this question, we need to consider both mythological and scientific evidence. Dragons, as described in ancient texts and folklore, are composite creatures. They hold characteristics of animals known to exist, like serpents, lizards, or birds of prey, mixed with extraordinary traits such as breathing fire or flying. From a biological standpoint, none of the known species combines all these sets of characteristics as dragons are described. Yet, it can be speculated that some ancient civilization, when faced with a real yet bizarre animal, may exaggerate some factors or tell a story that, in time, took the shape of the dragons we all know. For instance, the Komodo dragon is a big lizard native to Indonesia that possesses many traits anybody would associate with a dragon. Huge, deadly, and having a poisonous bite capable of bringing down game much bigger than itself. Although it does not breathe fire or fly, it is easy to see how ancient encounters with such creatures could have inspired stories about terrifying dragon-like monsters. Similarly, the crocodiles, which existed both in ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia and have very close relatives in many other regions, could easily have been incorporated into dragon lore. One of the largest and most dangerous species, the Nile crocodile, was greatly feared and revered by the ancient Egyptians. Its armored skin, sharp teeth, and powerful presence fitted many of the characteristics associated with dragons. Flying reptiles, a fortiori, are another clue. Though they disappeared long before humans arrived on the scene, their fossilized remains could have been discovered by ancient peoples. The idea of large flying creatures would not seem so outlandish to those who had unearthed these massive winged skeletons, and their likeness could be incorporated into myth and legend. With their leather wings and pointed beaks, pterosaurs do bear a passing resemblance to the dragons of the imagination, at least in Western mythology. Beyond biological possibilities, the persistence of dragons through many cultures may be evidence for psychological or evolutionary archetypes in the human mind. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychoanalyst, believed that specific mythological symbols, such as dragons, emerge from a collective unconscious, a repository of shared human experiences and instincts. This theory is perhaps suggesting that dragons tend to be a universal symbol with regards to evoking fear and awe. This would appear to explain quite well why dragons pop up so consistently in disparate cultures, even those that do not have any contact with one another. This does beget another question. If dragons are mythological in nature, then why do so many ancient texts and stories describe such creatures that closely resemble dinosaurs? Could the former be connected with the latter somehow beyond simple imagination? Collective memory of humanity. Perhaps one explanation lies with the concept of a collective memory. Long ago, actual animals passed along through successive generations, eventually mythologizing into dragons. According to such a hypothesis, early humans and maybe even pre-human ancestors could have found dinosaur fossils and thus explained them within the scope of their own cognition. For example, findings of large bones, say in areas like China, where the ground is riddled with fossils, would doubtlessly have resulted in fantastical explanations if one didn't know about paleontology. These were bones from creatures much larger than any living animal known to ancient people, such as Mamenchisaurus or Stegosaurus. Their appearance, massive ribs, sharp claws, long tails, could easily be seen as evidence of real dragons. This, in addition to the frequent revelations that many of them were often deep in the ground, actually may have led to the belief that dragons lived beneath the earth. A common motif in many dragon myths. Large bones found in ancient quarries may have contributed to stories about dragon-slaying heroes in Europe. Larger megalithic bones, such as those belonging to mastodons and woolly mammoths, could have been interpreted as proof of beasts, huge in size, that once roamed the land. It is even possible that early human beings who themselves coexisted with megafauna such as megalania, giant monitor lizards, or titanoboa, massive prehistoric snakes, could carry forward this memory of contact with such animals into their mythology. Over time, the details of these encounters would have been exaggerated and eventually grew into stories of fire-breathing dragons. Many indigenous cultures also have created stories based on their encounters with natural phenomena. One example is the thunderbirds of various Native American tribes, huge birds that bring storms and lightning. While certainly symbolic, such myths could also have picked up elements of sightings of the large bones of prehistoric birds or flying reptiles. In a similar vein, South American civilizations, particularly the Inca and the Aztecs, told legends of feathered serpents, including Quetzalcoatl, which combined birds and snakes into a dragon-like animal. The more we learn from paleontology, the more we learn just how much ancient peoples must have come in contact with the remains of prehistoric life. Their attempts at explaining the strange, gigantic fossils they encountered gave rise to mythological creatures that finally evolved into dragons. The residual life of dragons. Though scientific evidence points to the mythological creatures of dragons inspired by the discovery of fossils, prehistoric animals, and shared psychological archetypes, their lasting legacy in human culture cannot be denied. From ancient religion and folklore down to modern literature and entertainment, dragons' place within the human imagination remains secure. Dragons, in so many ways, are the personification of human ambition to explore and dominate the unknowable. They personify awe and terror over forces that remain beyond our control: earthquakes, predators, and our minds. By forming stories about these dragons, ancient peoples were able to inject meaning and thus order into a chaotic, unpredictable world around them. Nowadays, dragons have come to symbolize something powerful, mysterious, and fantastic. They are one of the most salient features in fantasy literature, film, and video games, generally depicted as ancient, wise, and very powerful beings. In these stories, they are not just mindless beasts, but intelligent beings with their own motivations, often acting as allies or adversaries to the heroes. Perhaps the most intriguingly strong facet of the dragon myth is how it has adapted and changed through cultures and time. Be they gods or demons, dragons reflect new meaning and forms through changes in human understanding of the world. From their ancient origins as symbols of natural forces to their modern role in fantasy today, dragons have remained a very powerful and enduring symbol in human culture. A myth rooted in reality. So, might dragons have existed? In a manner of speaking, the answer is both yes and no. As described in mythology, dragons never actually existed as literal creatures. It is biologically improbable because flying, breathing fire, and possessing several features from different animals make them hard to explain. But the myth and stories of the dragons could have been about real animals. Dinosaurs, great reptiles, and the fossilized remains of prehistoric creatures that early man interacted with throughout history. In this way, dragons are a peculiar blend of both realities and imaginings combined. They represent the consequence of a human drive to explain the world, account for what cannot be explained, and face the deepest fears and desires. Whether slaying chaos, guarding nature, or representing cosmic powers, dragons epitomize the possible complexities of the human experience. The dragon myth will likely continue well into the future, with ongoing discoveries about our past through science and archaeology. Once the scientific origin theories are explained, the fascination with these legendary creatures will always be there to fire the imagination of future generations, as they have throughout the ages. Thank you for spending time with us through Spookscope today. Feel free to share your knowledge and wisdom in the comment section, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share it with your friends and family. Until next time, my dear spooker, stay curious,